Complexity and contradiction in construction. And when I think about it, obviously we all interact with buildings on a daily basis, right? We're in one now. We've got a wall behind us where you live, where you work, but there's so much detail that goes into these buildings, particularly from an architect's perspective. And from our conversations that we've had previously, and hopefully we're going to dive into it a bit today, the contradictions that exist and the alternatives which are opposing against each other are probably getting more challenging. So there's a few areas that we're going to dive into today. So for example, the cost versus design, probably one of the big ones that architects struggle with in an industry that tends to value cost over anything else.
Oh, you're going to use the word some value engineering.
Yeah. Like thermal efficiency versus material cost again, how the trade-off of those and how an architect can balance those. Interior space versus wall thickness, especially probably with the regulations that have changed since the Grenfell disaster, now having to put 2 staircases in and losing a big internal space, but then you also the wall construction, and ultimately developers want to sell space. and then other bits including material sustainability. Before we get into that, should we introduce Paul, you've got 30 years experience in FMCG marketing, B2B marketing?
Yeah.
30-ish?
30-ish, yeah. Well, actually, but anyway. Yeah.
There you go. You also started life as an architect, right?
I was an architect for the first 22 years of my career.
And started your own company afterwards?
I was a director of 2 practices, so I was in architecture for 22 years, and I became a director of 1 practice which subsequently went under in one of the recessions, and then set up another practice which still exists with mine and my 2 former partners' name on it. I worked for a contractor for 3 years. When I was about to go back into practice, I was talking to the 2 former partners and whatnot, and my brother rang me up, who owned a marketing agency. He said, before you go back, can you come and help me out for a bit? 3 months turned into 6 months, and in the end I ended up taking over his agency. Didn't go back into architecture. And then worked in consumer marketing ever since. I've still got 1 consumer client who I've known for 25 years. And I worked on Arla Foods, which is in the news at the moment. Brands like Lurpak, Anchor, Cravendale, cheese, all manner of cheese all over the world. Canada, USA, Germany, China, the Middle East. But I then pivoted. I merged with the Danish agency because I was competing with them for this Danish client, Arla Foods, Danish-Swedish client. And I merged with them and I ran the UK operation for 15 years. But we pivoted towards B2B, and I focused on construction marketing because I understood construction materials. So I've got this weird sort of half and half life,
I guess it's an interesting balance, having the experience of working as an architect, but then how to actually talk to your audiences from your space and get in the customer's head. So right now when you think about architects, what's the main challenge that they're focusing, and likewise, I guess, how do they flip that to address it in terms of what they're speaking about?
It's like complexity and contradiction in careers. But I've been vice president of Manchester Society of Architects for 7-8 years. I've been involved in the society for 11 years. And so working with the RIBA, so I talk to architects like every day, all the time. I spoke to 15 of them last night. And pretty much I get the same story from all of them. And that is fees, salaries, and role. They're the 3 big things that bother them. Obviously, things like climate, design, the nature of procurement, that's another elephant in the room. But since Grenfell, design and build is in serious trouble, which has been driving the construction economy for the last 25 years. And that is going to be increasingly difficult now, because of the golden thread, the Building Safety Act. There's quite a lot of change going on, and then the introduction of the principal designer, which is confusing because there's already a principal designer under CDM 2015. But the main things that architects are worried about are you train for 7 years and then you look at the salary expectations. Fees have been driven down for all sorts of reasons. And there's got to be some sort of shift with all this.
So is there an oversupply?
There is an issue with oversupply, definitely. Yep. And that's to do with the business model of the universities. So it's a combination of that, a combination of knowledge, and it's complicated, but there is an element of supply. There's an element of just habit and the fact that architects aren't naturally trained in business.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's all about position. To put my marketing against, it's about positioning.
So in an environment where there's more practices going through the same work and how they differentiate themselves, I think one area that I've heard is about getting and understanding the detail and how they differentiate themselves. So is there, like particularly when we're talking around some of these things, topics we're going to cover today, from your experience, what have you seen where some get it and some don't, and what can they learn from that?
Because of my background, we ran an event which we're going to repeat in the new year on marketing and sales for architects, and I introduced areas of storytelling and narrative, because storytelling can help you increase price. And also in some areas of construction products, things like kitchens and bathrooms, with domestic clients, they'll pay considerably more for a kitchen, but it starts to question things like the price of the brick they want to use. Mm-hmm. And I think there is a general issue with architectural education, and most architects will be honest and say that they didn't have much background in this until they got into practice. And I think they just need more tools and that's because of my weird sort of career structure. That's something I'm really interested in, and that's why I stood for election with the RIBA Council, because I really believe we can do something about it. Because a lot of it is behavioural economics and how people judge things and how people consider things. There's a great book by Daniel Kahneman, have you heard of it? He's a behavioural economist.
Yeah.
Thinking Fast and Slow, he died a few years ago.
Yeah.
And one slide I always tell my clients is people make emotional decisions for rational reasons. And we all do it. And it's a case of how you frame things a lot of the time, in terms of how you communicate value. And so I think it's just learning new tools and techniques and stuff like that.
I guess the other side of it is, as a business, we often work in facades, and is also about creating, I think you've potentially used the word, but sophisticated simplicity in a lot of the designs. And
yeah.
It's hard to create a nice, simple solution, basically. And so one area I wanted to explore with you is around the trade-off between thermal efficiency and basically the environmental impact. Because I think, for example, U values, obviously there's a drive to bring them down, but then there's, on the flip side, how does that impact all of the other things that go up into the build of the facade? So maybe you could talk to some of your experience in how you navigate that complex scenario and the trading off between those two things.
I usually joke that architecture is founded on three principles that were coined, or at least expressed, in 15 BC by Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, who was the architect and engineer under Marcus Agrippa, who was the son-in-law of the Emperor Augustus. And basically he was given the task of making Rome a marble city, a city of stone, not marble, because it kept burning.
Yeah.
There were major problems with fires. But Vitruvius said there's three dimensions to architecture, and that's commodity, firmness and delight. Commodity is about planning and design and site and things like that. Firmness is about how you build it, longevity, robustness, keeping the weather, keeping the rain out, that kind of stuff. Which ironically, the Pantheon's actually got a hole in the roof. And delight, of course, is what makes it architecture. And then I say with marketing it's even simpler, because you only got two, which is price and differentiation. So I say, okay, we've got 5 things there, and basically working those together. But there's no question about it, you can't change one thing without affecting everything else. Buildings are so complex. And they're weird because they start off as immeasurable. This is Louis Kahn. In the mind of the architect and the client, and it's an idea, and it's just an idea from somebody's head that gets expressed. So it's immeasurable. And then you have to go through the measurable to build it, which is the details, the cost and the regulations. And then when it's finished, it goes back to being immeasurable again, because people look at it as a finished building and part of the built environment. But that bit in the middle, the measurable bit, is really difficult. And part of the problem is, I think, and why I mentioned about complexity and contradiction, is that you can't change one thing without changing lots of other things. Like one of those kids' puzzles where you got nine squares and you've got one empty one, and you've got to get the numbers in order. But in order to get them in order, you have to move them around about 50 times. It's like that. It's one thought, and you can't change it without changing everything else. For instance, you say the target is to reduce energy, conservation of energy and power, approved document L. We're going to get U values down to 0.28 or 0.31, or reduce them by 31% and 28%. Why it got two different values, again, don't know, in commercial and housing. But which ultimately means that you have to increase the cavity, which, as you quite rightly said before, that makes the building footprint bigger. And if you're on a constrained site, that means you've got smaller space inside. But it also costs more. And that's affected, of course, by the nature of the insulation. If you're going to use things like a mineral or rock wall or glass wall, you need far more greater thickness of that than you would with something like polyisocyanurate, PIR.
Yeah.
And because obviously combustibility, etc. So you then got a really thick wall, and which costs more. And if you're looking at facade design, where it's all built off a rain screen cladding system, then all of the bracketry, all of the metalwork has to be longer. So you're actually using more materials to achieve that. So you have to offset that against the energy saving, because it's costing more in terms of energy. And then, of course, then you think, well, what about approved document B? If you're making a cavity much bigger, that creates problems with how fire and air move around and moisture in the facade. So they're not simple. So by making something better, potentially you make something else more difficult.
So as a young architect getting into the industry potentially without access to your wealth of knowledge, what do they do in terms of trying to navigate these challenges, or as a practice? Because ultimately, if they can get this positioning across in a way to differentiate themselves and hopefully secure work.
Yeah. To go back to a contemporary of Vitruvius, it's a bit of a joke this, I got told not to say this to a bunch of students, but I quote Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, but the best example I've ever heard of the use of somebody expressing Marcus Aurelius was Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. Have you seen the movie?
Yeah.
There's a bit where Jodie Foster's, he's in a cage in the middle of this huge hall, and she's trying to get him to tell her who the killer is. And he knows who it is, but he wants her to discover it for herself. So rather than say, it's that guy, he says, simplicity, Clarice, read Marcus Aurelius. Of any given thing, ask what is its nature, what is its purpose? Which is straight out of, what does he do, this man? He covets. How do you learn to covet? You learn to covet by what you see every day. So I just say, look, thinking from first principles. That's where the architect really scores. Don't go and question everything. How do I do this? What's the best way to do this? Because the real skill of the architect is, and it takes a long time, it's not just a 7 years training, it takes years after that, before you can you understand the moves and think, if I do this, it'll do this, but it has to be something this way, because you don't go down cul-de-sacs, aren't fruitful, because you've learned. So the real skill of the architect is, it's the complexity. And bringing that simplicity is hugely difficult. And people think they can do this, and I think they can't, because you need the training to do it. If you apply that to, say, surgery, people will go, oh, surgery, brain surgery, that's incredibly complex. Yeah, you have to assist in like 5,000 operations before they'll let you loose on your own. But anything really worthwhile in our culture and society is complex. And to learn the skills to do that is difficult. And that is where architects can differentiate themselves, I think.
I completely agree. Obviously, a lot of architects can make lovely looking buildings, but understanding the detail, the design detail, to get it right. And it's obviously quite often that we come across schemes and you look at a section through the external facade and you think, wow, how has someone come up with that?
Yeah, there's several issues with that. Most young architects learn construction in practice. The universities and I don't think I'm being unfair here, they focus on different aspects, and there's a bit of an acid test with architects. I know a few architect practice owners are a bit naughty, and they ask a really... It's like the old Gordon Ramsay thing, is if you want to learn how good somebody is as a chef, get them to fry an egg.
Yeah, or make scrambled eggs, doesn't he do? I think at the
Yeah,
start, yeah.
Eggs are really
Start simple,
difficult, yeah. So it's understanding the kind of ingredients, if you like. But no, they have to learn it on the tools, and of course an experienced architect will look at, well, hang on, why are we doing that? You can get rid of that, and just do this. It's editing. Back to Vitruvius, it's a commodity, it's firmness. But if you concentrate on the delight stuff, yeah, you can't do that as an architect. You can't say, oh, I've designed this beautiful thing. I'll give you an example. Danish architect Jørn Utzon in the 1960s did almost like a sketch on a napkin for the Sydney Opera House and won an international competition. It's a brilliant idea. Now, Jørn Utzon was a brilliant architect, Danish architect. But he had this idea for this form, and then it worked out almost impossible to build it. They started building it before they knew how to do it. And the budget went up by a factor of 10. But of course, the government of New South Wales just looked at this iconic building in Sydney Harbour and thought, we've got to have this at any price. 4 separate firms of architects it were hired and fired or left. And it was, in the end, it was a Danish engineer called, who actually came up with what was built. So even with the best architects, you come with an idea, the construction of that can be incredibly complex. That's why, you need all 3 things in architecture. You can't just say, oh, I've got this beautiful building, but you got to have to build it.
I think that sometimes the best feedback that we get from people is from installers. People who are there actually physically fitting things on site and working out the complexities of that. Because until you get your hands on with some of these things, you can look one thing on a drawing, but very different from an install perspective.
When I worked for a contractor, I was a site architect for 7 months on a project. I was there like 3 days a week in a porter cabin. I was like hand sorting slates and dealing with subcontractors all the time. And let's just say some of the conversations were colourful. But I'm from a working class Scouse background. I'm a Scouser. And so when they started having the pop, I just lapsed into listen. But it's a good discipline, because you have to have respect for the people who understand they have to put these things on site. I've got a drawing actually I'm going to dig out of a building I did, which I did a lot of stonework, and some of it was internal, it was like sculptural, as well as external. And I remember going through the process of understanding the most efficient way to support it. But I've always been of the mindset like, hang on, I can do it simpler than that. There's got to be an easy way to do that. And you've got to learn those instincts, I think. You've got to learn those habits of, you look at something, then you have to basically edit it.
So it sounds like a bit of the mindset is, I guess, an intellectual curiosity over there must be a simpler way of doing this, instead of just adding more complexity into certain details.
Oh yeah, and we've got a good teacher in architecture. It's called gravity.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're holding up mass and engineers also go about limit state design and things like this, but when you're actually dealing with the facade design of a building, the architect has to understand it, and the detail then can be checked by the engineer in terms of its transferred load or imposed load. But the architect has to be able to juggle all those aspects. How do I get this thing to look the way it needs to be? I don't like saying the way I want it to look, because I think I think buildings eventually take over and they tell you what they want to be. But there's a state you need to get to, which is the simplicity. And simplest is the best. It's always the cheapest as well, usually. And that's a hard thing to do. We all learn it. I've got a huge sympathy for architects. It's a shocking learning curve, because you have to know so much about so many subjects and so many materials. And I always say to younger architects, look, the trick is to know enough how to ask the right questions of somebody who's got expertise.
So why don't we go into some of those areas to help them on that journey? In terms of the wall thickness versus the interior space, something that's probably coming up now, what are the key things that an architect should be thinking about in that area in terms of the trade-offs?
It depends on the site, of course, because if the site constraints are such that you've got space around the building,
Yeah.
then you can increase the footprint, which of course increases the building cost because it doesn't come at the expense of the internal space. But if you're building within a metre of a boundary, for instance, if the boundary is 1200 millimetres away, and all of a sudden you change your wall construction, it's now 900 millimetres, you get into a whole area there of fire. And that can cause all sorts of issues with things like glazing and the nature of the materials and means of escape. So it's, again, that kind of complexity. If you're in a tightly constrained site in an urban environment, then what's the trade-off?
I guess number one then is, where are you building?
Location.
What does the site footprint look like? Have you got room to increase the size of the building, which does obviously come at a cost. But if you don't have that, then what are the things that you can look at or play around with? Let's say you've got a very constrained site, that is what, I can't do anything about that, so is it about going back to the client and saying, to achieve X, Y, Z, you're going to have this floor space, or is there anything else?
It depends which becomes fixed. It's what's fixed. If you're dictated to by the approved documents, then if you want to work out the U value, there is a bit of flexibility with that because of the way the calculations, SAP calculations work, and so you can play a little bit with the wall thickness, but there's always a trade-off somewhere else. But it could be in the end that you're stuck with a budget and, well, we can afford that kind of construction. Then you get to decrease the size of the floor plate. We don't sell properties in this country. You go to Sweden or Denmark, and when they talk about a property, they don't say it's a 3-bedroom property. They say it's 65 square metres. Whereas we don't talk about it really in this country. We don't talk about the footprint, the area. And that's probably why our residential, housing, for instance, this country, is about 30% smaller than, say, Germany or Sweden. So that does play psychologically. Then the architect has to play more games internally in rearranging the space to make it a slightly smaller space. But the problem is with building perimeter. The best analogy I've heard was in the days when people used to go and buy ordnance survey maps from Waterstones, and then they used to go, flipping out, the bit I want is always on the edge of the map. Yeah? Which is why, by the way, ordnance survey decides to, you can order ones which the bit you want can be put in the middle. And the reason for that is that you got a far greater chance of being on the edge of something than you are in the middle, statistically, because the perimeter. There's a small change to the perimeter of a building can have a big change in terms of its area. So then the architect's skill is, okay, how do we make this work? How do we got a smaller footprint if we're in an urban location. Do you change the number of flats or apartments? Do you think, no, okay, we're going to maximise them, but they're going to be smaller? Then we have to think cleverly about the internal arrangements to make it work more efficiently. That's where the skill of that's commodity. It's amazing, it always boils down to one of these three things. It doesn't matter how hard you try. It's like the old idea, there's only 7 stories in the world. Have you heard that one?
No, I haven't heard that one.
There are literally only 7, like Rags to Riches, The Hero's Journey. There are only 7 stories. Nobody tries to invent an 8th story because they always find out it's a version of one of the other 7. And it's the same with architecture. It always comes down to one of those 3 principles. If you boil it far enough. The trick with architecture then is, how do you make it delightful? Even though you may be a bit compromised on area or on cost. And I think that's where the skill of the architect in arranging things.
Yeah, and I guess also, how do you make it delightful when people are constantly, all they probably want to talk to is cost?
If you think of any other area of life where you're procuring something, cost is always a factor, of course, but seldom is it the only factor. But I think that's, controversially, I think that's been bred into the construction industry through the way we procure buildings. And I don't mind saying it. It's been driven by D&B, it's been driven by value engineering, which is looking from a marketing perspective. When you say value to who? Yeah? Well, you're talking about price. And that's what we're talking about, is cheapness or price. And then you have to look at, okay, they'll say, we've got to save so much per 1,000 bricks. We need to cut the budget to get down to 250 quid a thousand or something. or we have to use a different, cheaper window system. So then I asked them, how much are you spending on the kitchen? And I spend enormous amounts of money on kitchens. I saw a house in Cheshire for a footballer in this kitchen manufacturer's office. And there's a central kitchen. And the kitchen was 150 grand. This was about 8 years ago. And I went, wow, I suppose if you love cooking and stuff. And they went, oh no, they won't cook there. There's a separate kitchen behind a door, which is another 60 grand, where they actually do the food prep. So this 150 grand kitchen is basically just for show, and for basically, it's like
that'd be nice.
The equivalent of the pass.
Yeah.
So there's a distortion in people in terms of what people value, and that affects what they believe about price. And construction is weird like that, because do people think like that when they go and buy a car, or clothes, or holidays? It's like a different set of rules applies, and that's artificial, that's a construct. There's nothing saying it has to be that price. That's just a construct.
It's interesting. So actually I'm just thinking about it because I've not ever really thought about it before, but compared to other industries, clothing, automotive, etc., there's much bigger, there's a brand loyalty, isn't there? And around those types of things. And within construction, I don't know if that exists, or maybe people just take it as a given that a building is built well until it doesn't go very well.
Generally speaking, it's like a black box, isn't it? People go and buy. I mean, my favourite one is Apple. Okay, I've got Mac, I've got iBook. Now, they're like more than twice as expensive as Android or PC. And then you listen to why people say why Mac's good. They say, oh, it's so intuitive. And I'm going, well, an Android isn't. You're right, it's branding, it's perception. Construction is a long way behind consumer marketing. People tend to immediately jump to price.
Yeah, and I think also something that's evident, especially with the shortage of houses that we've got, or the lack of new building, is that there doesn't seem to be much thinking about creating amazing spaces. I'm sure there is in pockets of the industry, but it's like purpose, build a house, get a space, move on to the next one.
Most markets work on supply and demand.
Yeah.
We've got a strange situation in this country, it's not just this country, where the major people who build houses control supply. So it's not the same kind of market. There's less competition. I think that's why a lot of people, for instance, I always go for older properties, even if they've got compromise and stuff. My house I live in now is 175 years old. Because I know what I'm getting, and I know what the construction is. And yeah, it's got problems for sure, but spatially, and from the point of view of architecturally, I think that's what I prefer, and I think a lot of architects feel that way. To build a new house to the kind of standards that architects would like is not cheap. But it's not like a car. The minute you go and buy it, spend 100 grand on a Jag or a Maserati or something, the minute you take it out of the showroom, it starts to lose value. Property's not like that. It does the opposite. It's going to be around, if it's built well and it's built robustly, then it's going to retain its value far longer and increase its value and retain its beauty and its utility. And so it's a very odd situation from a marketing perspective. And I'm still trying to get my head around a lot of this, to be honest, having worked in consumer stuff. But I know enough from that side of my life to know that a lot of this is just pure perception.
Yeah, I personally, so before coming into construction, I worked in different industries, and I think the industry has a huge amount to learn from others. It's so far behind in so many different ways. One of them is how it communicates, another way is process and just how things happen. But I think it is quite exciting in a way, or you have to have at least the hope that there's opportunity to change all these things. And I think that personally for me gets me quite excited for what we can do. But one thing I wanted to come back on a little bit is when you talk about them built well and structural integrity, is talking about the one of the trade-offs that we mentioned earlier in terms of thermal bridging and structural requirements. And from an architect's perspective, can we get into a little bit more in the detail about some of the things that they might be thinking of that, i.e. cold bridging, or if you're trying to increase your cavity size, you've got more brackets, bigger quantity, what kind of things that might be going through their heads at that?
You introduce different airflow patterns and things in wider cavities. I suppose it depends what kind of building it is, but obviously if it's an apartment building, which we build an awful lot of at the minute, in terms of facade design, then at every compartment, every floor and every compartment wall between apartments, you have to have a fire cavity barrier. Now, the way the technology works at the moment, you have to allow for air movement, because that's how rain screen cladding works, which is the predominant technology. But you have to be able to close those cavities in the event of fire. So that's quite complicated. So originally cavities were there for, if you go back to the origin of a cavity wall, basically the inner skin does all the load bearing work. The outer skin is weathering, and the cavity is so any water that penetrates through the outer skin drains down the inside face of the outer skin and then flows out the bottom. That's why cavity walls were brilliant. The dampness was not transferred to the inner skin in the way it was in solid construction. Cavity is a great invention. It's one of the best inventions in terms of getting rid of dampness, mould, water ingress, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the first temptation is you start stuffing things into that cavity. You insulate it because you want to get the interstitial condensation in the wall, not on the inside of the building. And then, of course, you think, okay, the insulation was basically, will improve the U-value of the wall. Now the wall is actually basically insulation, and then the construction has to work around that. So if we increase the size of that stuff, then you're going to introduce things like movement. How do you deal with fire? How do you ensure that they're all installed correctly so they work? Because it's complicated the more things we introduce into these things. Now, you've got to bear in mind that rain screen systems have only really been around since the 1960s. The first real example, perhaps a bit earlier than that, 1950s. The idea goes back a long way to Norway, but the real application of technology was only really started when they built the Alcoa building in Pittsburgh, because they wanted to demonstrate how you could make a building skin out of aluminium. So they actually created the rain screen system. So that technology is not that old, not in architectural terms. Walls have been around for thousands of years, but so I still feel like we're working out the wrinkles in this. We're still working out where and how everything performs. So you got the whole performance issue, then you got the complexity of the construction and how they all work together. And like I said, cold bridging, installing, well, I suppose windows are a good example of this, how you improve the U-value of a window, and you have to basically separate the outer skin. You basically create a cavity within the window frame, and you have insulating members that insulate, so you have thermal bridging. So you've got to hold out the outer skin, and you've got to transfer that load back to the inner structure, which means that you've got cold bridges. So then you start to use thermal isolation pads, but that's not simple, because then you have to do a whole calculation of the wall. And then the air movement within the cavity, that will affect its U-value as well. So it's not simple, so you're going to rely more and more on calculation systems, thermal modelling, and hence the complexity.
And I guess early coordination with manufacturers to help get their input on that.
Oh yeah. Most manufacturers understandably want you to specify their product.
Yeah, there's a vested interest.
Yeah, which is fair enough. But to do that, they will offer a huge amount of support to the architect or the architectural technologist, U-value calculations, thermal calculations, structural calculations, and that can all be done effectively free. It's not free because obviously it's included in the price of the product, but we're not whittling bits of wood on site anymore or chipping away at stone. We're building with systems that somebody else has patented and developed, fire tested, thermally tested. The expertise is in huge amount of expertise is in the manufacturers, And I'm a great advocate, because I've said the manufacturer's the architect's best friend. So the architect needs to know enough to say, you soon learn, when you run the practice especially, you get to a point where you think, okay, I've got an idea that needs to work, okay, and then you get on the phone, can you come in here? I need to look at this. What's the best way to do this? Okay, you just do this every day.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to deal with this and this. So the manufacturer's got a huge role to play in this. And most manufacturers are very advanced with this. Your own company is... You'd be crazy not to listen to you. I mean, you would be crazy not to listen to what you got to say.
Yeah, there's a lot, I guess the architect has to then... It's got... And it comes back to that complexity and contradiction in a way, because you've got a specialist in certain areas, but then when you incorporate one system with another manufacturer's products, you think, oh, hold on a sec, suddenly the situation has changed because these people have got different priorities to these people, and I guess the architect has to try and bring all that together to develop that simple solution.
When I was training, I worked for an architect, and he said to me, listen, Paul, he said, I'll give you the best piece of advice I can give an architect, young architect. I said, what's that? He says, all good buildings have got a bottom, a middle and a top. And then he said, what I'm trying to say is that architecture is about junctions. So you can design a brick wall, and yeah, it's fine, it's simple. It's simple till you turn a corner, or you meet the eaves, or you meet the ground. That's when the fun starts.
Yeah.
You have to incorporate a window, you have to think about thermal bridging, cavity barriers. You have to think about how you shed and get rid of water as it runs down the window. You see an awful lot of buildings nowadays, the water runs down the window, across the sill, and then you see underneath it 2 nasty stains at the side of the sill.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if it's render or something like that. And brickwork's a bit more forgiving. And you look back in details, and we worked out ways to deal with that, things called stooling and throating and stuff, and how you actually sit the brickwork on a stone sill. And that's the firmness bit and the delight bit. So the detailing of a brick wall when you put a window in it is not simple. And there's a lot of mistakes you can make, and they get made. And same when you hit a corner or a roof or the ground, or then you've got to think about thermal movement, you've got to think about expansion, because brickwork expands over time, concrete shrinks over time. So you have to think about movement, and I wrote a CPD on movement in masonry, which is all about movement joints. Then you find out that Hampton Court Palace, built 500 years ago, has no movement joints. Because it was built with lime mortar, it naturally expands and moves with time. Architects have to be generalists, but they also have to know specific principles to not make big mistakes. And so the interface between the manufacturer and the material and the architect is not a straightforward one. And of course I listen all the time to what manufacturers got to say, which is one of the reasons I like working in that industry, because an architect writes a CPD, I write from a point of view, what would I have wanted to know at this stage? What would have been useful to me? And how do I integrate that with the principles of what the architects are? And the issues of detailing, making sure you're not leaving your client with a maintenance problem, and also there's something that's going to stand the test of time. Because the most sustainable building is the one that hangs around for a long time.
Stands the longest. That's another whole contradiction that I don't think we've seen necessarily played out just yet. But all these new buildings that are being built with certain cladding on them, and no one on certain those claddings, no one's going to give you a warranty for certainly more than 60 years. And for example, glass, it's not going to last 60 years probably. Then you have to replace things, and then does the whole thing have to get demolished again?
Well, think about it, we're now building high-rise apartment buildings for rent using various range screen cladding systems or curtain walling systems. And like I say, some of those components in there have got a limited lifespan. You're not going to get a guarantee on a glazing unit beyond a certain point, 25 years maybe. So you think, hang on, that building's 70 stories. How are you going to replace those glazing units? Do you replace them all at once? If it's a hole in the wall, and the wall itself is, say, I'm a big fan of brick. Brick's a great material. No brick needs to be fire tested.
Yeah.
It's not required.
And gets better with age.
It gets better with age. If it's detailed properly, you don't have to worry about it for 100 years at least. And if the window's a hole in the wall, I'm not saying that you have to do this. I'm just saying it's easier to replace a window in a wall than it is to replace the entire wall. I mean, that's axiomatic. When we talk about sustainability and we talk about net zero and things like this, I think that's a really complicated issue.
I guess who's on the hook for, okay, when you're building it, yes, there's certain targets, but who's on the hook for the lifetime evaluation of the building?
Well, my feeling is it always comes back to the architect.
Yeah.
It always does. I was having a joke with, it's only half joking, at an event we did recently on the Building Safety Act and the issue of the principal designer under the Building Safety Act. And I said, look, I'm a marketer as well. I just think to myself, look, can you imagine the headline? Just imagine the Guardian or the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or Times or whatever. Can you imagine the headlines of principal designer found responsible, held responsible? So the first question is like, hang on a minute, what's a principal designer?
Mm.
And the journalist's going to go, and can you imagine the editor going, what the hell's a principal designer? But if you put architect in there, everybody knows what that is. Even if they don't really know it, they've got a sense of the architect's responsible for the way that building looks and how it looks over time. And I don't think the architect can ever escape it.
Mm.
They'll always come back to the architect. Nobody will remember who the builder was. They won't even remember who the client was.
Mm.
They certainly won't remember any of the building components. But most buildings have got attribution to an architect 100, 150 years later. Yeah, it sits squarely in the architect's world, I think.
Mm. And I guess to finish up, as an architect, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Sure.
There's lots of things we've spoken about today in terms of the complexities of, I guess, the changing environment, which is a good thing to push for more sustainable buildings, but all the different contradictions and complexities that exist. And when you get into the detail, it becomes very hard unless you've got the right support around you to make the right decisions. As an architect, what kind of the top 3 things that you'd say to go away and focus on being able to create sophisticated but simple buildings?
First of all, yeah, absolutely. I think it's Socratic. If we can save energy, we should.
Yeah.
If we can do things more efficiently, we should. Because it's about simplicity. And so that's a good principle. How you get to that principle is rather more difficult. I think from an architect's standpoint, I think I'd being absolutely bold about it, I'd say, first of all, accept the fact that it's always going to have your name on it.
Mm.
And not just from the point of view of legacy, but also from the point of view of the golden thread. The architect can never escape responsibility. We've got to make sure that we know, architects know as much as they can. They leave no stone unturned in exploring every option they can to make sure the building is robust.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that may mean thinking, okay, what's the trade-off between sustainability over what length of time? You can't say, well, it's got to pay for itself in 30 years. We should build, this building's going to last at least 100 years. Because to start messing around with it within 100 years cannot possibly be sustainable.
Mm.
And most buildings are very difficult to convert from one function to another. So that's the one thing. If you build a good apartment building, the way humans use space doesn't change that much. We've gone open plan over cellular over the past 100 years or so. But so one of them was have a focus on the future, build to last, because that is the most sustainable goal.
Mm.
To make sure you're not able to do things to it quickly. So from the energy point of view, the cost point of view, from the robustness point of view. The other one is you've got to think about the human world. You've got to think about the delight bit of architecture is the people who are going to live and work in your buildings. You've got to think about, well, does it work for them? Or are you going to impose your ego on them? Which sometimes happens. But most architects I know, they've got an idea they want people to enjoy living and working in their spaces, because why would you do it otherwise? Mm-hmm. And I think the third thing is architecture. we're not just building buildings. Building is not the same thing as architecture. Because architecture is the real public art you can't ignore. So we have a responsibility to future generations to make sure our places are not only functional and they work well, but they add to the sum total of human happiness. It's an art, and it's not a television programme, or a play, or a painting that sits in a building. You cannot avoid it. You cannot avoid the built environment. So the architect's responsibility is also to the culture in the future. And that's society. And the pressures on architects to worsen buildings for short-term gains, that's a serious problem for the future. Because architecture, the word architect comes from the Greek, and it means architekton, which literally translates as master builder. So even though we're not master builders anymore in the sense that we're in a great medieval church, cathedral building age, architects still are master builders, in the sense that we have to understand that we have to work on the basis buildings been around for a long time, and they have a role to play beyond their individual function.
I think hopefully some of the changes that are coming through maybe in the long term might be a more positive thing for architecture, although there's a lot more paperwork, due diligence, etc. associated with the golden thread and that role of the principal designer. There also maybe we're going back to the more like 1970s where what they specified and did sticks a little bit more and they got a little bit more control over that.
I think one of the things about the golden thread is it's going to be a very brave QS or project manager or contractor who tries to substitute this, because you've literally got your name on it. The whole idea of the golden thread is they can track you down as an individual. And I always think to myself, well, the architect's always been like that.
Yeah,
you know, they always know that you can't escape it. So embrace it. And I agree but the other important thing is we mustn't confuse the how with the why. Ultimately, all of this building technology, the regulations, which the Building Safety Act is way too complex. It's going to have to simplify itself because there's confusion in it. And I always say, trying to understand some aspects of the new legislation is a bit like trying to grab hold of a bar of soap in the bath. You think you've got it, then all of a sudden it's gone again. Even on CPD, I'm thinking, yeah, I've got it. Nope, it's gone again. But the architect's job is to understand the how. And most of the construction focuses on how you build it, how you do this. The architect is really, and this is why the role of the architect, and I'm a big fan of architects, because the architect's the only one in the whole process who understand why. And we have a greater responsibility to society, and that's enshrined in the RIBA's Code of Conduct, that we have a responsibility to society as well as our client. Nobody else has.
And I think the funny thing is that, in my opinion, is that I think in terms of building great buildings, and obviously cost and everything is a part of it, they don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? Which is if you get a simplistic design done and well coordinated from the start, actually what you'll probably find is that the building is built better on a tighter budget than something that maybe started complicated, got changed, all the things that go associated with that, and that project overruns and the cost goes up as well. So I think those two things can coexist quite nicely together and hopefully make everyone happier.
In a funny kind of way, there's a different angle, like Mark Twain. I'm sure it was Mark Twain who said it. He said to someone, sorry, I had to write you a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one. And I think that's the architect's skill, is they come up with a short letter. And absolutely, but like I say, I think we do this at our peril as a culture if we sideline architects. A good example of technology, great use of technology and modern methods of construction, the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. That's now being built out of modular elements, a long way from Antonio Gaudi started of the original facade. Funny thing, by the way, you know the stone they made, the original building was quarried not far from central Barcelona in a quarry, and they ran out of the seams of that stone, so they hunted around to find a stone that came close to matching it. And the stone they found actually comes from around Bolton.
Really?
Oh, that area, yeah. The stone that's going to Millie comes from northwest England.
There you go.
But yeah, so it is possible to create iconic world-class buildings using modern technology, using understood, edited, thought through and cost-effective materials. But there's a difference between saying, okay, this is as cost-effective as it can be and retain its quality. You go beyond that, you make it cheaper than that, you've compromised the whole thing and it all falls apart.
Yeah, which is a world that no one wants to be in.
No. Yeah. And it's important because the architect always has to have the longer term in mind. So it's a complex balancing act. But if we focus too much, where traditionally the client has been trying to offload responsibility for cost onto the contractor's going to do whatever they need to do to survive. And a lot of contractors have gone to the wall because it's almost impossible to do what they promise. They're going to build a building for 10% less than its construction value they know about. I've witnessed this. And hope it comes back in claims and variations. So their profit, or even their profitability, relies on the idea that people have made mistakes and it's going to cost to correct them on site. But of course, the better the technology gets, the contractors know that game's not going to last anymore. So we've got to have a realistic conversation about when we talk about cost, what we really mean. Cost to who?
Like all these things, everyone's been used to, although some people are unhappy about it, the people at the top funding have probably been used to getting certain margins for a while, and that's to come from somewhere. If the contractor, you've seen what's happened with a lot of contractors, and
they're going to the wall all the time, especially in the public sector. If you procure a building and the contractor hasn't priced it properly, and then they go boom. We had an example up in the north where it cost 100 million quid to fix. When we talk about value or cost, that's false economy. You can't get a quarter from a pint pot into a pint pot. We seem to dilute. I believe the architect probably has always known that buildings, you can't build that for that. You just can't. You're going to make a compromise somewhere, and somebody somewhere is going to pay for it. And that might be just in maintenance problems, or it's not as attractive. But as we found out in recent years, it can be far more serious than that. I'm a fireman's son. You know, I went into train as an architect with, remember my dad coming home from fires. So that was very much on my mind, fire safety. And I'm pleased to say that all the buildings I built were non-combustible. And I sleep at night. But without going into too much detail on that particular problem, there was definitely an issue there of lack of critical thinking.
Hopefully the changes that have come through, although they'll take a time to settle, and there'll be some adjustment to how, as you said, how complicated the process is, it will be a good thing for the industry to push in that direction.
We've just made major changes. We've introduced major changes to Part L, major changes to Part B. We've introduced Part O, overheating, which is an interesting one, isn't it? And it's like, how do these all relate to each other? Overheating, ventilation, insulation. We've overclad a lot of buildings, and then we get an overheating problem. And then think, okay, the way around that, and then is to have certain types of ventilation systems. It's like I said at the beginning, complexity and contradiction. To solve one problem, you end up creating a load more if you're not careful. And to some extent, it is a zero-sum game. You can't get everything you want. And I think it's going to take a long time, years, for the changes in legislation to shake out in terms of how this affects construction. At the moment, the Building Safety Act, there's quite alarming signs that its gateway 2 planning stages are being delayed significantly. And if things are delayed 16 weeks or more, it's going to end up being more cost. And it's complicated. It's complex.
Yeah, well, I think at the heart of it is construction is complicated, as we got into today. You look at a wall, you think that's pretty simple, but actually when you get into it, it's really not. And all these different junctions, as you mentioned earlier, the complexity grows, and I think collaboration with people who've got knowledge, I guess open-mindedness to finding and constantly searching for simple solution. I'm thinking, is this the best way of doing it? Is probably the way forwards.
I learned very quickly as a practicing architect, you surround yourself with people who are experts, and that's not missing fault. That's a good quality.
It's a good strategy to have.
Do you know what the one for every architect, the one lesson they learn in this, and you can then roll this out to every other specialism, because it's highly specialised now, of course. It was ironmongery. Okay, I was in an ironmongery showroom last night. Every architect I know, including me, has done an ironmongery schedule for a building, and you only ever do one, because then when you show it to the ironmongery specialist, they look at it and they go, "It's not quite like that," and you realise you made a pig's ear of it because you didn't really understand the way that hinges work. Or you think you do, but that's really dangerous. And after that, it's okay. And here's the plans. Do me an ironmongery schedule.
Yeah.
Because if I do it, I'll just get it wrong, and that's like adding insult to injury. It's like you're wasting time, you're wasting money, and you've frustrated somebody who's an expert.
Yeah.
It's like wrong. With your company, for instance, I have no hesitation to think, okay, what do I need here? All right, there's that company. They do this for a living.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all they do. Okay, I have to do all this other stuff. So I don't feel ashamed. I have to go and say, right, what's the best way to support this? Simply and cost effectively. And it still looks like we want it to look.
Mm-hmm.
And they go, yeah. They get a pencil out. Perhaps you think about doing this and do something counterintuitive. Now, most architects I know go, oh, that's good. They wouldn't feel humiliated by that. They'd just go, I learned something there.
Yeah, definitely. When you look at some of the solutions that he might create, you think these aren't major changes, they're subtle changes, and you think,
game changers. Oh yeah. It's all about the subtlety. Yeah, and small moves. And of course, if you take that and roll that across the entire building, all those little moves end up, I mean, it's a collaboration with a load of experts who are happy to work with you.
Yeah, exactly. Because we're talking, with some of these things, we're talking, if you just increase the stone thickness by 100 mil, it'd mean that maybe you can support the bricks on it there. You don't have to have an extra bracket here that's running all the way around the perimeter of the building. You can do all this and this, and you think,
logic.
Yeah.
You also put the cavity tray in the right place.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing we're talking about, what goes on around the edge of the slab, which is usually where things get supported. And the amount of stuff is... There's a great cartoon I saw once, Gary Larson. And it's like somebody in a dentist chair. And the dentist's sort of standing over them, and there's like tubes coming out, and there's the dental assistant there with like things in there. And the dentist's just holding a tennis ball saying, okay, Mr. Smith, we're just going to try and see if we can get this in there as well.
Yeah.
It's just eliminate things, edit things out. Is that necessary? Question yourself like that. You draw it, and the thing is, you know it doesn't look right. The minute you draw it, you think, that doesn't look right.
Yeah. It's
not resolved. And detail resolution, I learned this from my former partner, Phil. And I remember saying to him once, he said, for Christ's sake, lad, he said, try and get some simplicity in that. But simplicity is a very hard thing to get to.
It is. I mean, if it was easy, you'd just do it, right? That's the thing.
And there's always something you miss. Ben was talking to me about a detail, and I looked at that, and I just laughed out loud.
Yeah.
When I saw it, I said, of course.
Yeah.
And he said, all you have to do is like turn that upside down and get rid of that, get rid of that, get rid of that. And it looks exactly the same. I'm like, genius. But that's what happens when somebody, it's like an orchestra, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The oboe player has been playing that oboe for 25 years. So understand the dynamics of this tiny piece. And like the architect's kind of composer stroke conductor, if you like. But you don't have to know everything there is to know about how to tune a piano, or how to construct the reeds on an oboe. Eddie Izzard did a thing about the difficulty of actually trying to play an oboe, but it's recognising somebody else's expertise and saying, what's the best way to achieve this? And because you're orchestrating it. So that's, the architects to dance around, but they have to understand what they're looking at. So they have to know how to detail. And then when somebody comes along and says, I've got a better way of doing that, and you show it to them, you feel that flash of delight, you think, great, I'll remember that next time round. Unfortunately, next time round it'll be a different problem. But yeah, so it's an incredibly important collaboration, and I don't think we value the relationship with the manufacturer anything like we should.
Yeah,
Personally.
and I think one for us maybe to talk about is how I think embracing a bit more technology. There is a lack of it at the moment, but if we can get that right, make that whole thing a little bit more efficient. Because currently I think a lot of the industry relies on, you've got great knowledge, someone else I know has got great knowledge. But unless I tap into their particular head and their knowledge, then it's not well distributed, not well shared. And how can we build into a system so it's easier to self-serve and find those answers, as opposed to you need to speak to this person and you've got to speak to this person, which still needs to exist to provide that advice, but there's like that 0 to 80 that potentially can be done automatically, let's say, so you're not repeating some of the same mistakes.
Exactly, but you also get the people in the same room. It's amazing that you get a brickwork supplier, brickwork masonry support supplier, you get the structural engineer in the room, you get the architect in the room, and you say, okay, we're trying to achieve this. They'll all have an anecdote or an experience. They go, oh yes, it reminds you of something I did, because they've done loads of it. And then you get them talking together, and all of a sudden it's solved. And you get a QS in the room as well, and you get them nailed down, don't you?
Yeah. That's a whole different story. I'm personally quite excited by, there are a lot of challenges, but there's also so many opportunities. It is very difficult, this industry, because there's a lot of, but this is where we've always done it. There's a lot of that exists, and also in an industry that, right across the board, apart from with developers, there's not many pockets of people that actually make good money in construction.